So while reading the preface to Richard Longenecker's second edition of Biblical Exegesis in the Apostolic Period, his section on quotations or allusions caught my attention because the point he was making there is very important, and the way he made it is very applicable to my approach to Scripture. When we study the Bible's use of the Bible, like the New Testament's use of the Old Testament, one of the first questions we have to ask is, what exactly counts as our data? When do we look at a New Testament passage and know for sure the New Testament author or tradition actually had a specific Old Testament passage and context in mind? Are we only looking for direct quotations, like when Matthew says, as it says in the prophet Isaiah? And of course, there's some debate on what constitutes a quotation and what is considered more of an allusion. For example, when John opens his gospel by saying, in arche, in the beginning, is he quoting Genesis 1:1 or alluding to it? Because some instances of the New Testament's use of the Old Testament are not quotations, they're clearly intentional allusions. Like when Jesus says, just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. That's a clear and intentional allusion, but is it a direct quotation? Now, when John the Baptist is said to be wearing camel's hair and a leather belt, is that an allusion to Elijah or something more subtle, something we might call an echo? And are we even looking for echoes? Like when Jesus spends 40 days in the wilderness before entering into his ministry in the promised land. Is that an echo or a coincidence that we are making more of than the original audiences might have recognized? So whatever we're looking for, the more subtle it gets, the easier it is to imagine connections that might not actually be there. And at the same time, tradition can seem really subtle to the outsider while functioning like a megaphone to anyone who's actually inside the community of that tradition. For example, imagine someone 200 years from now in a country well separated from the United States, trying to understand why this one little phrase could start a fight at a family Thanksgiving dinner when somebody at the table said, "Let's make America great again." And a fight broke out. To someone completely removed from the current American political milieu, those words may sound fairly simple, even harmless. Who doesn't want things in their country to be great? But to someone inside the political and cultural world of that phrase, those words were not subtle. Those words activate an entire web of meaning. They call up emotional associations, political loyalties, fears and hopes, accusations, memories, slogans, personalities, movements, and counter-movements. Depending on the audience and the expected interpretive tradition, one politician could use that phrase as a banner of hope and unity, while someone from the other side of the aisle could use it to evoke everything they believe is dangerous or corrupt about their political rivals. The phrase is the same, but the tradition of meaning surrounding the phrase changes how the phrase is utilized and heard. And that tradition of meaning is totally dependent on the community hearing the phrase. The community has like this entire economy of interpretation governing what they expect to hear and how they interpret what they hear. Everything depends on the traditional community, the interpretive economy, receiving that phrase. So that's why I find the distinction Longenecker highlights from Michael Fishbane so helpful. Fishbane speaks of the Traditum, the written revelation, and the Traditio, the interpretive tradition. The Traditum, according to Fishbane, is the received textual form. For example, the book of Habakkuk as preserved in manuscript witnesses. And the Traditio is the interpretive tradition within the ancient community that helped them know what the textual material meant and how it should be heard and how it should be performed. In other words, there's the received textual material itself, which was originally written down for the purpose of being performed out loud in front of an audience. And then there's the living tradition of interpretation by which that community understood, explained, and applied that performance. So in terms of our example of a political speech containing the phrase, "Make America Great Again," the Traditum would be the text of the speech scrolling on the teleprompters. The speaker would perform the speech, and the audience would interpret exactly what that speech, including any phrases and idioms like "Make America Great Again," meant for them. And really, if you think about it, the Traditio doesn't just govern how they interpret the speech, it kind of governs the kind of speech they expect to hear in the first place. So the distinction between Traditum and Traditio is helpful, and it needs to be discussed within an oral traditional framework. When we're dealing with biblical texts that emerged from oral traditional cultures, the written text itself is not just this flat, fixed literary object sitting apart from a greater world of tradition. The written text is really kind of like a fossil of a culture of traditional performances. It's a preserved representation of something larger than itself. The text is there, but without the Traditio, it's hard to know what the text itself actually meant. The text was written down for the purpose of being publicly performed to an audience who held the Traditio, the key to interpretation, within their hearts and minds. So in an oral traditional culture, these two layers of performance and interpretive tradition are deeply intertwined. The traditional material required to interpret the text is larger than, more expansive than, greater than any of, and really greater than all of the texts that we have in our possession. We don't just have a text of Habakkuk, we have multiple manuscripts of Habakkuk. The original audiences who heard the performances of Habakkuk, they carried this greater economy of traditional understanding and interpretation that is by necessity greater than the performance they were receiving, because this greater economy of traditional material was required to interpret each performance. So for this video, what I want to do is look at the textual traditions of Habakkuk, so that we can see how we might do the work to dig deep into the text that we have and some of the historical cultural milieu, so that we can grow in our understanding of the biblical Traditio or Traditios, which will help us answer this question: what data should we be working with? Where do we find clear connections of the tradition to itself in the texts that we have? How do we know the Traditio to apply to the Traditum that we have? So the textual tradition of Habakkuk is not best understood as a collection of documents trying to represent a perfect word-for-word original text that Habakkuk or one of his followers sat down and wrote one day, expecting that the consonants that they wrote down would never shift throughout time. That's not how oral traditional cultures work today or then. We shouldn't consider the witnesses to the book of Habakkuk that we have in our possession to be a set of ancient manuscripts that are products of copyists always trying to preserve that word for word original text with some accidental variations along the way, as if the Traditio of Habakkuk was not somehow greater than the Traditum of the text of Habakkuk. And when we look at the witnesses to the Traditum of Habakkuk that we have, we can see that this is actually true. That the evidence demonstrates that the ancient textual witnesses represent meaningful performances of a shared tradition. They show both fluidity of performance and stability of tradition. The textual tradition of Habakkuk does not represent a community that is seeking to preserve a word-for-word holy text, but rather what we see is an oral culture of traditional meaning that was presented and received through a fluidity of performance held within a stability of tradition. If almost all we have in our possession is actually various traditums, how can we responsibly theorize concerning the traditio required to interpret them? And that's where we come into the idea of controls. How do we know where we're engaging traditio, where we're seeing the text interpret itself by referring to itself? How do we have controls for knowing that? What's the data that we're working for? So Longenecker, in this section from Longenecker labeled quotations or allusions, he discusses concerns over controls for determining the traditio, for identifying the relevance of traditional material in the Traditum. He's asking, when we identify biblical quotations, allusions, and or echoes, what prevents us from speculation? What keeps us from saying, this reminds me of that, therefore I'm going to treat my impression as a connection that the original authors never had in mind? And for my purposes, I wouldn't use the phrase original authors as much as I would say something like, what keeps us from saying, this reminds me of that, and then treating our impression as a connection that the traditional culture wouldn't have made? Because maybe we should stop thinking about original authors and start thinking about a web of tradition that found its way to various forms of writing. At any rate, Longenecker appreciated Fishbane because Fishbane attempted to give us methodological controls as a way to talk about interpretive tradition while preventing the discussion from becoming uncontrolled speculation. The first control is defined as explicit quotation formulas, where a text tells us it's citing earlier material. If the Traditum clearly designates the phrase as a quotation, then we know they saw it as a connection to other parts of the Traditum in connection with their Traditio, how they understood and interpreted the text. Second, parallel texts within the received tradition. This is where the same feature appears in more than one textual witness or related page. So if the phrase or theme or scene is clearly repeated across the Traditum, it must have a special role in the Traditio. When we see it show up, we know that that's data we're dealing with for how the New Testament is using the Old Testament, that this is being used in some sort of interpretive manner. Third, density of occurrence, where repeated terms, themes, or sustained lexical links create a cumulative case that one text is intentionally engaging another. And that's helpful because it allows us to ask not merely whether two texts sound familiar, but whether there is enough evidence to identify a real tradition of interpretation behind them. So that's great. We need to have some kind of control so that we don't create connections that don't exist. That's not helpful for us to understand the material if we're reading truth into it that was never meant to be read into it. And we need to make sure we understand how traditional cultures, like the cultures that left the Bible behind for us, how traditional cultures utilize their traditional material. For what we're looking for as it pertains to connections in the traditional material, the traditio, the tradition of interpretation, can be really surprising, unexpected. Yes, we need controls, but we also need to understand that there's a deeper imagination within oral traditional cultures than what our modern Western post-Gutenberg text-saturated, scientifically analyzing brains would expect. For example, when I say the word Lebanon, what comes to your mind? For most of us, I bet that Solomon's temple was not one of the first things that you thought of, or maybe anywhere near what you thought of. In just a bit later on, you'll see that ancient Jewish interpreters heard Lebanon, and in the right context, they thought temple, or our community that stands in place of the corrupted temple. And that's a subtle nuance that we can only grab through a very extensive and special application of something like Fishbane's controls that really process how traditional cultures work. So that's what we want to do. The rest of this video is I want to demonstrate through the discussion of selected manuscripts of Habakkuk how we might see the Traditum and the Traditio in the biblical material through an oral traditional approach to the text. The basic idea is that in oral traditional cultures, a performance does not have to say everything in order to communicate everything it means to say. And any given performance cannot exhaust the tradition it represents, because that tradition, the greater tradition, is necessary to interpret each performance. A word, image, phrase, or scene can activate a much larger field of traditional meaning, and there's no way to sit down and describe every aspect of the tradition that gives every word, phrase, theme, scene, and performance method its meaning. The written performance is not the whole tradition. It's a doorway into the tradition. And that's why I argue that the performance cannot be faithfully received without the context of the tradition. To put it in terms Longenecker is teaching us, the Traditum is not faithfully received apart from the Traditio. John Miles Foley said it this way: tradition, understood as the set of idiomatic implications to which any performance institutionally refers, provides the ambient context for faithful reception. In other words, Foley's not saying that tradition is a decorative extra added on top of the words. He's saying that tradition is the ambient context. It's the world of meaning in which the performance can be faithfully received. One simple way to picture this from our perspectives as outsiders of the tradition is to think of the Traditum as the molten material we have in front of us, and the Traditio as the mold that helps us give it shape. We have the words, but without the interpretive world of the community, we may not know what shape those words were meant to take. One thing we'll see as we explore the Habakkuk tradition is that the tradition of reception, the Traditio, may be discovered to some extent by comparing various examples of reception, such as a commentary or paraphrase. For example, we can compare the interpretive approaches of 1QP Habakkuk and Targum Jonathan, because the idea is that any given text of Habakkuk functions as a kind of tradition bearer. It represents a tradition larger than what any single written form can fully contain. We have a text on a page that was going to be read to a community, and that community was expected to have the key, the interpretive tradition, to understand what the performance of that text meant for them, right? So any given manuscript gives us the words, but those words are only one performance of how that part of the tradition could be communicated. The struggle for us modern readers, is to discover the fuller tradition of interpretation that stands behind the textual performances we still have from the ancient faith cultures. Looking at 1QP Habakkuk and Targum Jonathan is interesting because they both represent a form of interpretation of Habakkuk by ancient communities. 1QP Habakkuk is basically a commentary. It's what's called a pesher. It quotes Habakkuk, some text from Habakkuk, and then says, here's what this means for us. Targum Jonathan is not a commentary like that, but it is a paraphrase, and a very large paraphrase in many places. It's a paraphrastic Aramaic performance of the prophetic text. So it's not just a translation, it renders the text in a way that already intentionally includes interpretation. So when these two very different kinds of witnesses make the same or similar interpretive moves, that becomes significant. We might be seeing more than two isolated creative readings that happen to overlap. We may be seeing a shared traditio, a tradition of interpretation that was understood even across different sects or slivers of the biblical community. We might be seeing a shared traditio standing behind both performances of the book of Habakkuk. So one example that we discover as a potential sign of interpretive tradition in the communal tradition of Habakkuk is in Habakkuk 2:11. In the Masoretic tradition, and the Hebrew standing behind most of our modern English translations, Habakkuk 2:11 says, "For the stone from the wall will cry out, and the beam from the woodwork will answer it." So it's a vivid image. The building materials themselves testify. The stone cries out, the beam answers. But the Hebrew itself, the Masoretic text itself, does not explicitly explain exactly what the stone and beam are crying out about. But here's what happens in Targum Jonathan. Targum Jonathan renders the line like this: "For the stone from the wall cries out against the robber for it, and the board from inside the rafter responds to it." So that's an interpretive expansion. The Targum doesn't just say the stone cries out, it tells us what the stone is crying out against: the robber. Then, when we look at 1QP Habakkuk, the pesher appears to preserve a very similar interpretive instinct. 1QP Habakkuk 10:1 reads, "For its stones to be in oppression, and beams of its woodwork in robbery." So here's the connection. The Hebrew text gives us the image: stones and beams crying out. Targum Jonathan says the cry is against the robber. 1QP Habakkuk speaks of the stones in oppression and the beams in robbery. So these are two different kinds of textual performances. One a paraphrase, one a pesher commentary, and both understand the image of the crying building materials as connected to robbery. The Traditum seems to say the stones cry out and the beam answers. The Traditio says they cry out because the house is implicated in robbery and oppression. So it's not entirely surprising that the ancient tradition would have shared this interpretation. And the context before the building materials testimony is discussing the proud man's life of basically being drunk off of violently taking other people's stuff. But what we do see here is a common, even if somewhat expected, interpretive tradition found in different witnesses. And Habakkuk 2:11 is not the only place where 1QP Habakkuk and Targum Jonathan seem to be drawing from a shared tradition of interpretation. Another important example, and perhaps a much less expected interpretation, appears in Habakkuk 2:17. In the Masoretic tradition, Habakkuk 2:17 speaks of the violence of Lebanon, the destruction of beasts, the blood of man, the violence of the land, the city and all who live in it. And that's a vivid language. But the Hebrew text itself doesn't explicitly tell us what all of these things represent, how they work, what's going on. It doesn't explicitly tell us what Lebanon represents, if it's not actually Lebanon, or why Lebanon would have a part in all of this. It doesn't tell us who the beasts are, what the city is in view, or how all of these images are supposed to be mapped onto the world of interpretation. But Targum Jonathan does something kind of interesting. It interprets the violence of Lebanon as the violence of the house of the sanctuary. It interprets the destruction of the beasts as the plunder of his people. It identifies the land as the land of Israel and the city as Jerusalem. So in Targum Jonathan, Lebanon is not merely Lebanon. Lebanon, surprisingly, is the sanctuary. The beasts are not just animals that people are worried about. They're connected to the people. The beasts dying robs the people. The land and the city are not generic. The land and the city, not so surprisingly, are Israel and Jerusalem. So then, when we look at 1QP Habakkuk, we find a remarkably similar interpretive map. In the Pesher, Lebanon is interpreted as the congregation or community. The beasts are the simple ones of Judah who keep Torah. The city is Jerusalem, and the violence of the land is connected to the cities of Judah, where the wicked priests rob the wealth of the oppressed. But what's interesting here is how this sectarian community, no longer trusting in the temple authorities, identified Lebanon not with the temple, but with what they believed to be its more faithful current representation, their own community. And scholars have noted that the community seemingly understood itself as being a temporary replacement for the sanctuary in Jerusalem. I get that primarily from Ian Werett's article, The Evolution of Purity at Qumran, in the work Purity and the Forming of Religious Traditions in the Ancient Mediterranean World and Ancient Judaism. Specifically, you can look at page 500. So, Targum Jonathan says Lebanon means the sanctuary. 1QP Habakkuk says Lebanon means the faithful community that stands in place of the sanctuary. So it makes sense that the community that understood itself as a faithful sanctuary-like replacement or representation over against the corrupt temple establishment would read a part of its Traditio that points to the temple as pointing to itself. So here again, we're not just dealing with one random verbal overlap. We're seeing a shared interpretive constellation. We're seeing a shared interpretive constellation. We're getting to look behind the veil a bit, behind the text of the Traditio. Some of this interpretive tradition that stood behind the text and how it was interpreted. Lebanon is the sanctuary or community. Beasts are dealing with the people. The land is Israel or Judah, and the city is Jerusalem. So that's what we mean by a shared Traditio behind the performances. The written text gives us Lebanon, beasts, land, city, and violence, but the interpretive tradition teaches the community how those images are supposed to be heard. Kevin Cathcart and Robert Gordon, on their work in Targum Jonathan also identifies Lebanon with the sanctuary in Jeremiah 22:20 and Zechariah 10:10, which means that Habakkuk 2:17 is not just a one-off guess that Lebanon would equal the temple. It seems to belong to a broader interpretive tradition in which Lebanon could activate temple or sanctuary associations. Perhaps one theory is because the cedar from Lebanon was used in the construction of Solomon's temple. 1QP Habakkuk then appears to draw from a similar tradition that we find in Targum Jonathan, but applies it in a sectarian or community-centered direction. The same phrase has a similar meaning because of a shared traditio, but because this specific community has kind of a different traditio of how they understand themselves in the temple, then they receive that a bit differently, even if it's connected in some ways. So this matters because it shows us the difference between the written wording and the living interpretive tradition. The Traditum gives us the image, the Traditio gives us the map, and when two very different performances, a paraphrase and a Pesher commentary, map the images in similar ways, we have reason to think we're glimpsing a shared tradition of interpretation that existed behind both textual performances. Now, these examples from 1QP Habakkuk and Targum Jonathan are especially useful because they show shared interpretive tradition, but the larger argument is not only that these sources sometimes agree, the larger argument is that the textual witnesses to Habakkuk, like the Septuagint, the Peshitta, and others, don't just reproduce words attempting to recreate verbatim presentations of original text. Instead, they intentionally and uniquely perform traditional material, expecting it to find meaning through the interpretation of a greater web of traditional references. In other words, since the text is not everything that matters, but it is a part of the flow of a greater traditional world, then when we find variants in other versions like the Septuagint, maybe we're not finding mistakes. Maybe, like when we find this hidden traditio behind the mentioning of Lebanon, maybe what we find in these other early versions is another peek behind the curtain of this traditio of how the text, the tradition, was understood. Some variations between the versions and their witnesses can be explained by graphic mistakes, difficult Hebrew, rare vocabulary, perhaps through theoretical variation in forlag, or a translator making sense of a hard phrase. But even when that's true, when we look at the evidence in the witnesses of Habakkuk, the final product is not random. It's not just verbatim translation and then a hiccup of a misunderstood word that kind of is disconnected from what's around it. Actually, what we find is these final products of the Habakkuk manuscripts, they're smooth, coherent, meaningful performances of Habakkuk. And the nuance that a version draws out is not foreign to the Masoretic tradition. It's something that could be interpreted from the Masoretic tradition, but these versions will bring specific nuances to the surface more explicitly. So the ancient versions aren't merely translators or copiers of the Masoretic text. They're not simply failed attempts for word rendering. They're performances of a greater traditio. Each performance draws out certain possibilities from within the tradition. One of the clearest examples of this is Codex Vaticanus, which is the witness of the Septuagint that I chose to work with. And since this was the major Greek source of my project, I refer to it as G for Greek. G is especially important because it represents one of the early major versional performances of Habakkuk. And it is also one of the most creative and coherent performances. When I say early, I know that Codex Vaticanus dates more to the 4th or 5th century, but the Septuagint itself is an early tradition. So G does not simply give us random deviations from the Masoretic tradition. It performs Habakkuk with a sustained theological emphasis. And that emphasis can be summarized like this. G presents Habakkuk as a drama of ungodliness, Chaldean discipline, divine faithfulness, and final reversal. In the Masoretic tradition, Habakkuk begins by crying out over violence, trouble, and perverted justice. But G draws out the theological nature of that violence by rendering it as ungodliness. And that's important. G's not merely saying that bad things are happening in Habakkuk. G is saying the community is marked by impiety, covenantal corruption, and rebellion against God. The ungodly oppress the righteous, Torah is broken, and justice is distorted. Then in verse 1:5, G shifts the addressees. Instead of addressing the nations, calling them to look and marvel, as the Masoretic tradition does, G addresses the despisers. Now, this could be described as just a visual mistake. They misread one word for another when they were translating this. But it works so well in the context, the overall flow of Codex Vaticanus, or G, what I'm calling it, because Codex Vaticanus is a lot to say over and over. So in context, these despisers, instead of speaking to the nations, G addresses the despisers. These despisers seem to be the ungodly ones from the opening complaint. So G performs the passage as if God is saying, look, you ungodly despisers, I am raising up the Chaldeans against you. That means the Chaldeans are not merely an invading empire in G. They're clearly identified as the concrete instrument of God's discipline against the ungodliness of Judah. Definitely in M, made more explicit in G. G also gives, and by M I mean the Masoretic tradition, G also gives Habakkuk himself a more defined role in this drama. In Habakkuk 1:12-17, G does not present the prophet as merely confused, offended, or emotionally reacting to Babylon's violence. Instead, Habakkuk isn't just like, whoa, God, these Babylonians, they're worse than we are. Like, what's up? As if it's just his own emotions, a response. Instead, Habakkuk is said to be formed by God for the purpose of reproving God's discipline. So the prophet's protest is not faithless resistance to God. It's not something he needs to grow out of. It's actually part of his prophetic calling. G has already framed the Chaldean coming as God's corrective discipline against the ungodly in Judah. And now we see that Habakkuk is raised up by God so that he can question that discipline according to God's own holiness, eternity, and justice. The prophet's complaint becomes a faithful reproof of the way divine discipline is being carried out. How can the holy God use a wicked nation in such a way that the righteous are swallowed up with the ungodly by these ungodly people? God himself calls his prophet to call him to account for this disciplinary measure. So this adds another layer to G's coherent performance. God raises up the Chaldeans as discipline, but God also forms Habakkuk to reprove that discipline. In other words, G does not flatten the theological tension. It intensifies it. The Chaldeans are truly God's instrument, but the prophet's protest is also truly authorized. G, therefore, performs Habakkuk as a text where divine discipline, prophetic reproof, and the preservation of the righteous all belong together. So, G does not leave the Chaldeans in control of the story. And this brings us to Habakkuk chapter 2. In the Masoretic tradition, the vision is said to surely come. But in G, the text says, if he should tarry, wait for him, using a masculine pronoun for him. And that masculine pronoun is important because the word vision is feminine in Greek. So G appears to connect the vision not to this abstract event that surely will come, but to a coming agent, this male figure of him. And I argue that contextually, the only thing that really makes sense for this pronoun is the Chaldean nation, the Babylonian. In other words, for G, the vision is not just a message about something that's coming, like maybe a vision of salvation, even in spite of the Chaldean invasion. In G, the vision is bound up with the coming of the Chaldeans themselves. They will surely come. Their coming will not be meaningless. It will serve God's disciplinary purpose. And yet again, G does not let Babylon become sovereign. In 2:5, G makes it clear that the boastful one will not accomplish his own purpose. So the Chaldeans may accomplish God's purpose, but they do not accomplish their own. They are instruments, not ultimate rulers. Their violence is real, but not final. And this comes to a climax in the woe section in 2:17, where the Masoretic tradition speaks of the violence of Lebanon. G again uses the language of ungodliness. The ungodliness of Lebanon will cover the wicked. So G draws out a powerful reversal of fortune. The ungodliness of the ungodly that they thought would bring them success or happiness or whatever, it comes back upon them. And so then when we get into Habakkuk chapter 3, G carries this performance to its conclusion. G does not merely preserve the ancient theophany word for word. It performs the chapter as the revelation of God's redemptive purpose and the reversal of arrogant authorities, totally in line with everything all the points it was making about the Chaldean invasion. God's wrath is directed not merely against waters in G like it is in the Masoretic tradition, but against scepters and powers. God's wrath moves against these earthly images of power and pomp. Pomp is turned into bondage. Human authority is brought low, and at the end, where the Masoretic tradition echoes Davidic victory language from 2 Samuel 22 and Psalm 18, G doesn't do it the same way. G gives this unique phrase that God will set the prophet's feet to consummation. That connects beautifully with the end that is said to come upon the ungodly in Habakkuk 1:9. Utilizing the same word in both places, the tradition of Habakkuk in G declares that just as the ungodly find their end, the persecuted righteous, represented by the prophet, find their consummation. And this beautiful reversal is demonstrated from start to finish. So G has performed the whole book as a movement from ungodliness to discipline to endurance by God's faithfulness, even his faithfulness in raising up a prophet to rebuke his own move of discipline. And finally, the consummation and the end of the ungodly. So this is exactly what I mean by performance. A text critic might look at individual places in the witness to the Greek Septuagint in Habakkuk and say, well, this thing right here could be a graphic confusion. This could be a difficult Hebrew phrase that the translator was dealing with. This could be a different forlog. And those questions matter. But when we step back and look at it, G is not a coherent mess of mistakes of translating a perfect holy set of Hebrew consonants. And G has taken this reading and woven it all together into a meaningful performance of Habakkuk that probably, very almost definitely clearly represents an understanding of the tradition of interpretation of the time. And G's not alone in this. Targum Jonathan, represented by manuscript Oriental 2211, performs Habakkuk through traditional takes on Torah, wisdom, the Mimra, sanctuary, and Israel's narrative memory. Targum Jonathan, or T, as I refer to it sometimes, is more obviously paraphrastic. We've talked about that, so it's kind of in its own category, but it helps us see the interpretive tradition more clearly because we're literally seeing an interpretive paraphrase. T does not simply translate Habakkuk, it explains how Habakkuk was heard. The vision in Habakkuk 2 is connected directly to Torah. The righteous are preserved by the truth of the word that's already been revealed. The Mimra protects divine agency from being reduced to just Gentile violence. And Habakkuk 3 becomes an expansive activation of Israel's story concerning Torah, creation, Eden, flood, Babel, Exodus, the Yam Suf, Judges, and the nation's opportunity to repent. The Peshitta, which I refer to as S because it's Syriac, performs Habakkuk differently. It doesn't seem to have the same creative freedom as G, coming a little later than G, but it still has a coherent emphasis of its own. S, the Peshitta, highlights the shared insolence of Judah and Babylon and makes it clear that the insolent in Judah are judged through this nation that is equally insolent, Babylon. And Judah is not innocent in contrast to Babylon. Judah is implicated too. Therefore, the only hope that anyone, including Judah, can have is that Yahweh remembers compassion in anger. And that becomes especially clear in Habakkuk chapter 3, where S's key prayer is, in anger, remember your compassion. The question that drives the whole chapter for S. The Vulgate, or V, maybe I should have said L for Latin, whatever, gives us another kind of performance. Jerome, in translating the Vulgate, comes later. He's more removed from the ancient Jewish tradition and receives Habakkuk through a Christian and Latin interpretive stream, but he clearly highly respects the traditions that came before him. V often seems to honor both M and G by blending them together. So even Jerome translating the Vulgate, it doesn't say, oh, clearly the Septuagint is messed up. We need to get rid of all of this interpretive influence that draws us away from this Hebrew original. He understands that there's a real tradition there, and so he blends them a lot of times. He'll move into one and then transfer into something from the other. It's actually really, really interesting. It's not as creatively bold as G. It's more consolidating. It preserves, harmonizes, and expands. Its emphasis, it still has kind of an emphasis of its own, and it falls on the futility of the wicked before the eternal God. The wicked are like wind. Their power shifts, passes, and falls. And in 2:4, V draws together M's proud, not upright soul, and G's if he withdraws, to create this clear contrast between the faithless one and the righteous one who lives by faith. And even smaller witnesses contribute to the picture. 8-12 mostly aligns with the Masoretic tradition, but its preservation of that masculine pronoun in Habakkuk 2:3 shows that even a Greek witness that seems to be a more word-for-word translation from something close to the Masoretic tradition could retain traces of the Greek interpretive performance. There's this Barberini version of Habakkuk chapter 3, and it emphasizes swift divine action and victory beyond suffering. Myrrh 12 is very close to M, but it has this great activation of Psalm 77 in 3:10, where it kind of accidentally, because the language is so similar, accidentally quotes Psalm 77 instead of staying consistent to the Masoretic tradition as it did in other places. which just shows how stable Hebrew transmission could still be shaped by memory and related traditional material. So, when we look across the witnesses, the point is not that every variant is equally meaningful. The point is very simply that the ancient versions often preserve coherent performances of Habakkuk. They draw out different possibilities within the tradition, which likely shows us a look at the traditio of the ancient community, the greater tradition standing behind the traditum or traditums that we have before us today. Together, they show us that Habakkuk was not a original that was copied. Habakkuk was this greater living tradition that was performed to an audience that had a larger understanding of the tradition and its potential meanings. So this needs to influence how we understand what we mean when we say Traditum. The Traditum is what we have written on the page, and we may have many valid witnesses in textual form. And those multiple examples of Traditum can be read together, like we just kind of talked about, to help inform us, to help us grow in our understanding of the greater Traditio that they all represent and relied upon for their fuller interpretation. The written form, the Traditum, must be heard in relation to the living interpretive world, the Traditio, that gave those performances their meaning. So, to bring all this back to where we started, this is why the question of quotations, allusions, and echoes is so important, and also why it's so complicated. Longenecker is right to warn us that we need controls. We can't simply say, this reminds me of that, and then build an argument on our own impressions. The more subtle the connection, the more carefully we need to ask whether the connection is really there. Do we have explicit quotation formulas? Do we have parallel texts within the received tradition? Do we have density, repeated words, images, themes, or structures that make intentional engagement more likely? Those questions matter. And we also need to keep in mind that in an oral traditional world, meaning is not scientific and analytical as much as we would want it to be. Meaning is not carried only by exact verbal repetition that can be systematized and charted. A tradition can be activated by a word, an image, a phrase, a scene, or even a recognizable pattern. Lebanon can mean Solomon's temple. What that sounds like a faint echo to us might have sounded much louder to people who lived inside the tradition, and there may be some clear megaphone-sized activation that we don't even recognize on first glance. We have to do hard work to dig behind the veil to the Traditio. That's why the distinction between Traditum and Traditio is so helpful for me. The Traditum is this received material that we have, the words, images, and textual forms that have been passed down. And the Traditio is this interpretive world that teaches the community how to hear that material. The Traditum gives us the words, the Traditio gives those words their resonance and meaning. So earlier, we used this metaphor of a mold. We saw the Traditum, the words we have left over on the page, as the molten metal. And we saw the Traditio, the environment of traditional realities in the hearts and minds of the community, as the mold that actually gives the molten metal shape and form and meaning. And that's a great analogy from our current outside of the tradition perspective. But that's not a great metaphor for how oral traditional cultures themselves operated from within their performance culture. It's a lot more intricate than that. I think a better analogy for us to think about how they worked, not just how we're working to get back to them, but a better analogy of how they worked is maybe language itself. Before I can speak a sentence to anybody, I already have to live inside a language. I don't invent grammar every time I open my mouth. I already have a whole world of language to draw from. I draw from words that are shared, patterns that are shared, idioms, assumptions, shared associations that already exist before my individual act of speech. I'm actually constrained how I can speak by the shared tradition of language shared by those to whom I want to communicate. And the person hearing me also has to live inside that same language, or at least understand enough of it to be able to receive what I'm saying. If I use an idiom like, that really opened up a can of worms, the literal words are not enough. The hearer needs the shared world of meaning that teaches them how that phrase works. And that's closer to how oral tradition functions. The Traditum is like the words, phrases, images, and forms that are actually spoken or written down. And the Traditio is like the language itself, the grammar, idioms, patterns, memories, expectations, and shared associations that allow those words to mean what they mean in that community. And then the performance is the actual act of speech. It's a particular use of the language in a particular moment for a particular audience. And so that audience has the language itself to understand that particular speech act. And here's where this metaphor of language works way better than the molten lava or molten metal one, because language doesn't stay frozen. The English that I speak today isn't exactly like the English I spoke when I was a kid. I never said 6-7 or, skibbity Ohio or whatever the cool words are. That's not them. But language doesn't stay frozen. The way people use language can reshape language over time. A phrase can develop new associations. A metaphor can become a common idiom. A powerful speech act can become part of the community's shared vocabulary. Saying, I have a dream today means something a lot different in many contexts than it did before the civil rights movement. So the performance draws from the tradition. But once that performance is received, remembered, and repeated, it can also contribute back to the tradition and shape the traditio. So that's a lot closer to what I think is happening in the textual tradition of Habakkuk. The ancient witnesses are not merely pouring fixed material into a fixed mold. They're speaking the language of the Habakkuk tradition. They're drawing from its vocabulary, themes, images, expectations, and interpretive patterns. And when those performances were received by communities who had the language to hear that performance, those performances became part of the continuing life of that tradition. So the performances we've discussed from the tradition of Habakkuk gave us this concrete example of this. The textual witnesses of Habakkuk aren't just either preserving or corrupting words. They are performing a tradition. They are speaking a language. The language of Habakkuk knew that Lebanon means sanctuary. The language of Habakkuk in Qumran knew that Lebanon could mean our community. G shows us how an early Greek performance can draw out sustained theological reading of Habakkuk as a drama of ungodliness, Chaldean discipline, prophetic reproof, divine faithfulness, and final reversal. And the other versions also contributed their own meaningful performances. So we're learning that we are listening for how Scripture was remembered, received, interpreted, activated, and performed within living communities. All this matters for studying the New Testament's use of the Old Testament because the apostles and gospel writers were not modern footnoters. They were traditional performers of Israel's scriptures. They could quote directly, they could allude indirectly, they could echo whole worlds of meaning through a phrase, image, or pattern, maybe even some that aren't obvious to us but would have been blaringly obvious to them. So when we study Scripture's use of Scripture, our task is to hold both truths together. We need methodological restraint and we need traditional imagination. We need controls and we need ears trained to hear how tradition performs, and we need to realize that tradition performs in ways that our modern scientific post-Gutenberg Western text-saturated world might find surprising.